My sister faked diabetes, destroyed my insulin to control me, and I survived her cruelty, exposed her lies, and took my revenge in court today. I was 7 years old when the doctors told my parents I had type 1 diabetes. The diagnosis came after weeks of concerning symptoms, constant thirst, frequent urination, dramatic weight loss, and fatigue that left me sleeping through entire afternoons. My parents had initially attributed these changes to a growth spurt, or perhaps stress from starting second grade. But when I began vomiting and couldn't keep food down, they rushed me to the emergency room. The blood test results were devastating. My glucose level was over 600 milligrams DL, more than 3 times the normal range. The pediatric endocrinologist explained that my pancreas had stopped producing insulin, the hormone necessary for cells to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. Without daily insulin injections, my body would literally starve while drowning in sugar, leading to diabetic ketoacidosis and eventually death. Those first months were a whirlwind of learning. My parents attended diabetes education classes, learning to count carbohydrates, calculate insulin doses, and recognize the signs of both high and low blood sugar. They practiced giving injections on oranges before graduating to my thin arms. Our refrigerator filled with insulin vials, our kitchen cabinets with glucose tablets and juice boxes for treating low blood sugar episodes. My sister Jade was 12 then, old enough to understand that something fundamental had changed in our family dynamic, where once she had been the center of attention as the eldest child. Now every meal revolved around my blood sugar checks and carbohydrate counting. Every family outing required preparation, packing extra supplies, researching restaurant menus, ensuring access to medical care if needed. Jade watched as teachers gave me special accommodations at school, allowing unlimited bathroom breaks and snacks during class. She observed how relatives asked about my health at family gatherings, expressing concern and admiration for how well I was handling such a serious diagnosis at such a young age. She noticed how our parents' conversations increasingly centered on my medical needs, my doctor appointments, my latest glucose readings. The resentment began subtly. Jade would accidentally eat the juice boxes designated for my low blood sugar treatments. She'd hide my glucose meter before meals, claiming she hadn't seen it while our parents searched frantically. When I complained, she'd roll her eyes and mutter about how everything had to be about my diabetes, how the whole family had to revolve around my medical schedule. Our parents, overwhelmed by managing a child with a chronic illness, initially dismissed Jade's behavior as typical sibling rivalry. They encouraged me to be understanding, explaining that the diagnosis had been hard on everyone, that Jade was still adjusting to the changes. They didn't recognize the growing darkness in her jealousy, the way her eyes would narrow when people expressed concern for my health. The first serious incident occurred when I was 10. Our family had planned a camping trip to celebrate Dad's birthday, a tradition we'd maintained for years. The night before departure, I carefully packed my diabetes supplies, insulin pens, glucose tablets, ketone testing strips, and my meter. Everything was organized in a special cooler designed to keep medications at proper temperature. I woke the morning of the trip feeling slightly nauseous and thirstier than usual. When I tested my blood sugar, the meter displayed high, indicating a reading above 600. Panic set in as I checked my supply bag, only to find it empty. Every insulin pen was missing, along with my backup supplies. My parents found them in the garbage can outside, deliberately discarded and ruined by the summer heat. Jade claimed innocence, suggesting I must have forgotten to pack them properly. I knew the truth. The way she avoided eye contact, her overly casual demeanor, the slight smirk she tried to hide, all pointed to sabotage. Instead of celebrating Dad's birthday in the mountains, we spent it in the pediatric ICU as doctors worked to bring my blood sugar under control and reverse the early stages of diabetic ketoacidosis. The pattern continued throughout middle school. Jade would tell classmates I was faking my symptoms for attention, that I exaggerated my condition to get special treatment. She'd spread rumors that I could turn off my diabetes when convenient, implying the whole thing was an elaborate performance. Teachers began questioning whether my accommodations were truly necessary, influenced by whispers that I was manipulating the system. When I started high school, Jade had already graduated and moved away for college. I thought the worst was behind me. Without her constant undermining, I began to thrive. My diabetes management improved, my confidence grew, and for the first time since my diagnosis, I felt like I could be a normal teenager who happened to have diabetes, rather than a diabetic who occasionally got to be a teenager. Chapter 2. Jade's Return and Escalation. Jade returned home at 22, having dropped out of college after 3 years and a series of failed relationships. She moved back into her childhood bedroom with no clear plan for the future, claiming she needed time to figure things out while working part-time retail jobs that barely covered her personal expenses. I was now 17, more independent in managing my diabetes, and planning for my senior year of high school. I'd learned to handle my condition with minimal parental intervention, checking blood sugars regularly, adjusting insulin doses for meals and exercise, and recognizing the early warning signs of both high and low blood sugar episodes. But Jade's presence changed everything. She watched my routines with intense interest, asking detailed questions about my symptoms, my medication schedules, my dietary restrictions. At first, our parents were pleased, thinking she was finally showing mature concern for my well-being. They didn't notice the clinical nature of her observation, the way she studied me like a specimen rather than showing genuine care. Jade began inserting herself into my medical appointments, claiming she wanted to learn how to help in emergencies. She sat in the endocrinologist's office, taking notes as the doctor explained insulin-to-carb ratios and the importance of maintaining stable blood glucose levels. She asked probing questions about hypoglycemic symptoms, diabetic ketoacidosis, and the long-term complications of poorly controlled diabetes. "I want to be prepared," she told our parents. "If something happens when you're not home, I need to know what to do." They praised her newfound responsibility, grateful that their older daughter was finally taking an interest in family matters. They couldn't see what I saw, the calculating look in her eyes, the way she seemed to be memorizing rather than learning. The first sign something was seriously wrong came during a family dinner 6 months after her return. Jade suddenly pushed back from the table, her hand pressed to her forehead, claiming she felt dizzy and shaky. She described symptoms that sounded eerily familiar: trembling hands, confusion, cold sweats, and an urgent need for sugar. "I think my blood sugar is dropping," she announced, her voice weak and uncertain. She'd never been diagnosed with any form of diabetes, but our parents immediately sprang into action, offering her juice and crackers while someone fetched my spare glucose meter. The reading showed 98 mg/dl, completely normal for someone without diabetes. Jade looked at the number with apparent confusion. "That can't be right," she insisted. "I feel exactly like how you describe your low blood sugars." She turned to me for confirmation. "This is what you feel like at 98, isn't it? The shaking, the sweating?" I stared at her, recognizing my own words being reflected back to me with disturbing accuracy. She'd captured not just the physical symptoms but the specific language I used to describe them, the particular way I expressed the urgency of hypoglycemia. It was like watching someone perform an imitation of my most vulnerable moments. Our parents rushed her to the emergency room, where blood tests revealed normal glucose levels and no signs of any metabolic disorder. The doctor suggested she might be experiencing stress-related symptoms, or perhaps reactive hypoglycemia, a condition where blood sugar drops after eating certain foods. Jade latched onto this explanation, claiming it must be what she was experiencing. Chapter 3. The performance begins. Over the following weeks, Jade's episodes became more frequent and elaborate. She'd timed them perfectly to coincide with family gatherings, school events, or moments when I was receiving medical attention. Each performance was a masterpiece of mimicry, incorporating subtle details that only someone who had studied diabetes extensively could know. She complained of dawn phenomenon, describing how she woke with high blood sugar despite not eating anything. She spoke knowledgeably about the Somogy effect, claiming her body was overcompensating for nighttime lows by releasing stress hormones. She used medical terminology correctly, discussing concepts like glycemic index, insulin sensitivity, and carbohydrate absorption rates. The most disturbing aspect was how she'd appropriated my personal experiences. Stories I'd shared about particularly frightening low blood sugar episodes became her stories, retold with minor modifications but maintaining the emotional core that made them compelling. She described the terror of waking in the middle of the night with severe hypoglycemia, the confusion and disorientation that made simple tasks impossible, the relief of feeling glucose tablets dissolve on her tongue as cognitive functions slowly returned. Our parents were completely taken in. They made appointments with specialists researching reactive hypoglycemia and prediabetes. They modified family meal plans to accommodate Jade's supposed dietary needs, purchasing special low-glycemic foods and timing meals according to her claimed blood sugar patterns. The attention and concern I'd grown accustomed to receiving was suddenly divided, with Jade's mysterious condition often taking precedence because it was undiagnosed and potentially dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Jade had complained about being overlooked in favor of my medical needs. Now she was manufacturing her own medical drama to reclaim the spotlight, using my actual condition as the script for her performance. But what made it truly insidious was how she'd learned to weaponize my symptoms against me. During one of my genuine hypoglycemic episodes, Jade began exhibiting identical symptoms simultaneously. She claimed we were both experiencing low blood sugar, creating confusion about who needed immediate treatment. While our parents debated how to handle two apparent medical emergencies, my blood glucose continued dropping to dangerous levels. I finally had to break the strange symmetry by testing both our blood sugars, revealing my genuine 52 milligrams DL against her normal 89 milligrams DL. "But I feel exactly the same as you," she protested, even as I consumed glucose tablets to prevent loss of consciousness. "How can our symptoms be identical if my blood sugar is normal? Maybe the meter is wrong, or maybe I'm more sensitive to normal fluctuations than most people." The doubt she introduced was poisonous. If Jade could experience severe hypoglycemic symptoms with normal blood sugar, what did that say about the reliability of glucose meters? About the validity of symptoms as indicators of medical emergencies? She was creating a parallel reality where feelings mattered more than facts, where subjective experience could override objective measurements. Chapter 4. Infiltrating the community. Jade's next move was perhaps the most calculated and harmful. She began attending diabetes support groups, introducing herself as someone with atypical blood sugar issues that doctors were still trying to diagnose. She shared her story of mysterious episodes that perfectly mimicked diabetic hypoglycemia, but occurred with normal glucose readings, positioning herself as a medical mystery that challenged conventional understanding. The support group members, mostly people with type 1 or type 2 diabetes, welcomed her warmly. They understood the frustration of unexplained symptoms, the challenge of getting doctors to take concerns seriously, the isolation that comes with managing a misunderstood condition. They offered advice, shared their own experiences, and provided the emotional support that had drawn Jade to the group in the first place. But Jade wasn't there for support. She was there to perfect her performance. She listened to genuine stories of diabetic emergencies, absorbing details about how different people experienced hypoglycemia, what specific words they used to describe ketoacidosis, how family dynamics changed around chronic illness management. She was conducting research, collecting source material for her ongoing deception. Worse, she began spreading misinformation. She claimed that prolonged exposure to insulin could cause non-diabetics to develop hypoglycemic episodes, a completely false theory with no scientific basis. She suggested that family members of diabetics might become sensitized to blood sugar fluctuations through some undefined mechanism of proximity exposure. "I've been living with my diabetic sister for years," she told the group. "I think all the insulin in our house, the constant talk about blood sugar, the shared meals calculated for diabetic management, I think it's affected my own metabolism somehow. Has anyone else experienced something similar?" The question planted dangerous seeds. Group members began questioning whether their own family members might be at risk, whether diabetes could somehow be contagious through environmental exposure. The facilitator, a certified diabetes educator, tried to correct these misconceptions, but Jade's earnest delivery and apparent personal experience gave her claims a persuasive authenticity. She also began offering advice based on her research, suggesting treatment approaches that could be harmful to actual diabetics. She recommended ignoring glucose meter readings in favor of subjective feelings, arguing that everyone's body responded differently to blood sugar changes. She suggested that frequent testing might actually worsen symptoms by creating psychological dependence on numbers rather than internal awareness. "Trust your body," she'd say, echoing popular wellness rhetoric. "These machines can be wrong, but your symptoms never lie." It was advice that could literally kill someone with diabetes, where untreated hypoglycemia can lead to seizures, coma, and death within hours. I learned about her support group activities when several members approached me at community events, asking about my sister's condition and whether I'd noticed similar symptoms developing in myself or other family members. Their questions revealed the extent of Jade's deception and the dangerous misinformation she was spreading. When I confronted her about attending the support groups under false pretenses, she became defensive and accusatory. She claimed I was gatekeeping diabetes, trying to maintain exclusive ownership of a condition that affected the whole family. She argued that her symptoms were real, even if doctors couldn't explain them, and that she deserved support and understanding, just like any other person dealing with unexplained health issues. "You're not the only one who suffers," she said, her voice rising with practiced emotion. "This whole family has been shaped by diabetes. We've all made sacrifices, adjusted our lives, dealt with fear and uncertainty. Why should you be the only one allowed to get help for how it's affected you? Chapter 5, The Escalation. The situation reached a new level of dysfunction when Jade announced she'd researched her condition online and discovered she likely had reactive hypoglycemia triggered by insulin exposure. This completely fabricated diagnosis became her new identity, allowing her to claim legitimacy while maintaining the mysterious, undiagnosed status that made her condition seem more serious and interesting than garden-variety diabetes. She began demanding accommodations similar to mine. She wanted her own refrigerator space for special foods, her own medical emergency kit, her own schedule considerations for meals and activities. She claimed that my insulin supplies needed to be stored separately from food she might eat, arguing that even minimal exposure could trigger her episodes. Our parents, exhausted by years of managing one child's chronic illness, and now faced with a second child's mysterious condition, began treating both of us as medically fragile. Family activities were planned around 2 sets of dietary restrictions and emergency protocols. The house became a medical facility with duplicate supplies, monitoring equipment, and careful documentation of both our conditions. But Jade's demands went beyond practical accommodations. She wanted equal attention, equal concern, equal recognition of her suffering. When I had a severe hypoglycemic episode that required emergency treatment, she'd develop simultaneous symptoms that demanded parallel care. When I received sympathy for a diabetes-related complication, she'd share her own story of living with an invisible illness that doctors couldn't properly diagnose or treat. The competition became exhausting. Every aspect of my medical experience was mirrored, appropriated, and sometimes exaggerated in Jade's parallel narrative. If I described the fear of nighttime hypoglycemia, she'd share how she'd started setting alarms every 2 hours to check for symptoms. If I mentioned the social challenges of managing diabetes in public, she'd discuss how people dismissed her condition because it didn't fit conventional medical categories. She even began experiencing diabetic ketoacidosis symptoms despite having normal blood sugar and no ketones in her urine. She described the metallic taste, the deep breathing, the abdominal pain, all classic signs of DKA that she'd learned from my experiences and medical appointments. These episodes would send our parents into panic mode, rushing her to emergency rooms where confused doctors would run extensive tests, only to find nothing medically wrong. The emergency room visits became routine. Jade would arrive with textbook symptoms of serious diabetic complications, but every test would come back normal. Doctors began suggesting psychological evaluation, wondering if stress or anxiety might be causing her physical symptoms. This only reinforced her narrative of being misunderstood by a medical system that couldn't recognize her unique condition. Meanwhile, my own medical care became complicated by the constant comparisons and questions about whether both conditions might be related. Doctors started wondering if there was a genetic component they were missing, some family predisposition to unusual metabolic disorders. Appointments that should have focused on my diabetes management became investigations into potential family syndromes. Chapter 6, The Breaking Point. The truth began to unravel during our extended family's Thanksgiving gathering. Relatives who hadn't seen Jade's condition firsthand were witnessing her episodes for the first time, and some were more observant than our immediate family had been. My cousin Marcus, who was visiting from medical school, watched Jade's performance with growing skepticism. When she began exhibiting signs of severe hypoglycemia just before dinner was served, he offered to help by checking her blood sugar with his glucometer, a newer, more accurate model than the ones we'd been using at home. Jade initially resisted, claiming she could manage her symptoms with food, but Marcus insisted that such severe symptoms needed monitoring. The reading showed 95 milligrams DL, perfectly normal. When tested again 10 minutes later, after Jade had consumed juice and cookies for her low, the reading was still 95 milligrams DL. "That's physiologically impossible," Marcus said quietly, pulling me aside. "Blood glucose doesn't remain that stable after consuming rapidly absorbed carbohydrates, especially in someone claiming to have reactive hypoglycemia. Either she doesn't have the condition she claims, or she's taking medication to artificially stabilize her blood sugar." The second option seemed unlikely given that Jade had no access to diabetes medications and no reason to take drugs that would prevent normal blood sugar fluctuations. The first option, that she was faking everything, was almost too disturbing to consider, but the evidence was becoming undeniable. Marcus shared his observations with my aunt, who was a registered nurse. She began paying closer attention to Jade's episodes, noting inconsistencies in her symptoms and the suspicious timing of their onset. During one dramatic episode where Jade claimed to be experiencing severe hypoglycemia, My aunt quietly observed that her pupils were normal size and responsive, not the dilated, sluggish pupils that typically accompany true low blood sugar. The confrontation happened that evening, after most of the extended family had left. My aunt approached Jade directly, asking detailed questions about her medical history, her symptoms, and the treatments she'd tried. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Jade's story began to fall apart. She couldn't explain why her blood sugar remained stable despite consuming treatment foods. She couldn't describe the progression of her symptoms in medically consistent ways. She couldn't provide coherent answers about which doctors she'd seen or what specific tests had been performed. Most telling, she couldn't explain why her reactive hypoglycemia only occurred in the presence of family members, never when she was alone or with friends. Chapter 7. The discovery that night. Our parents made a decision that should have happened. Months earlier, they searched Jade's room. What they found was a detailed journal documenting her research and planning, a record of deliberate deception that revealed the true scope of her manipulation. The journal contained pages of notes copied from diabetes websites, medical articles, and support group discussions. She'd created a comprehensive study guide for faking diabetes, complete with symptom timelines, appropriate responses to treatment, and strategies for maintaining credibility during medical examinations. But the most disturbing entries were her personal reflections on the process. She wrote about the satisfaction of finally receiving the attention and concern she'd craved for years. She described the pleasure of watching our parents worry about her, rush to care for her, prioritize her needs over mine. She detailed her plans for escalating the condition, possibly transitioning to claims of full diabetes or other serious illnesses, if the reactive hypoglycemia diagnosis became insufficient. The journal also revealed the calculated nature of her timing. She'd deliberately scheduled episodes to coincide with my genuine medical needs, creating competition for resources and attention. She'd studied my patterns of hypoglycemia, learning to predict when I might need emergency treatment so she could manufacture simultaneous symptoms that would divide our parents' focus. Most chillingly, she'd written about me with cold analytical detachment, describing my reactions to her episodes, my frustration with the divided attention, my growing isolation as the family dynamic shifted around her manufactured crisis. She saw my distress not as evidence that her behavior was harmful, but as proof that her strategy was working. Finally, one entry read, "Everyone sees that I need care too. Finally, I'm not just the healthy daughter who has to be grateful for her good fortune. I have something that requires attention, consideration, modification of family plans. I matter as much as my sick sister." The revelation devastated our parents. They'd spent months accommodating Jade's supposed condition, modifying family routines, seeking medical opinions, providing emotional support for what they believed was a genuine health crisis. They'd worried about her, lost sleep over her symptoms, felt guilty about potentially overlooking her needs in favor of my more obvious medical requirements. But they'd also enabled her deception by dismissing signs that something wasn't right. They'd wanted to believe that their older daughter was finally showing maturity and family commitment, even when her behavior seemed off. They'd chosen to trust her claims over their own observations, prioritizing family harmony over medical accuracy. The confrontation was explosive. Jade initially denied the journal's authenticity, claiming someone had planted it to frame her. When that defense proved unsustainable, she shifted to justifying her actions, arguing that her emotional needs were as real as my physical ones, that the family's focus on my diabetes had damaged her in ways that deserved recognition and treatment. "You all act like physical illness is the only kind that matters," she screamed at our parents. "What about the psychological damage of growing up invisible? What about the trauma of watching everyone worry about her while nobody cared about my struggles? My symptoms might not show up on blood tests, but they're real to me." Our parents, finally seeing the full extent of her manipulation, gave her 30 days to find alternative living arrangements. The decision was firm and non-negotiable. She'd violated family trust in ways that couldn't be repaired with apologies or promises of better behavior. The risk to my actual health, the waste of medical resources, the emotional manipulation, all of it had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Chapter 8. The final act. Jade spent her final weeks in the house alternating between rage and calculated manipulation. She tried to convince individual family members that she'd been misunderstood, that the journal was taken out of context, that her condition was real even if her documentation methods were flawed. She contacted relatives, friends, and support group members with her version of events, painting herself as the victim of a family that couldn't accept her illness because it threatened my special status. Some people believed her. Medical conditions, especially those involving blood sugar, can be complex and difficult to diagnose. Her story of having symptoms dismissed by doctors and family members resonated with others who'd experienced medical gaslighting or struggled to get appropriate care for unusual conditions. But the evidence was overwhelming, and most people could see through her manipulation once they understood the full scope of what she'd done. The support group asked her not to return, recognizing that her presence had been harmful to members who needed genuine assistance. Her few remaining friends began distancing themselves as they realized the extent of her deception. I thought the worst was over. Jade would move out, our family would begin healing, and I could return to managing my diabetes without the additional stress of her manufactured competition. I was wrong. The morning before her departure deadline, I woke to my insulin pump alarm indicating an empty cartridge. This was impossible. I just filled it the night before with a brand new cartridge that should have lasted 3 days. I checked my backup insulin pens in the bathroom medicine cabinet, empty. The emergency supplies I kept in my bedroom, gone. The extra vials stored in the kitchen refrigerator, missing. Every drop of insulin in the house had vanished. I found Jade in the kitchen, holding my entire insulin supply, representing thousands of dollars and weeks of life, over the garbage disposal. Her expression was calm, almost serene, as she watched me process the situation. "If I can't have diabetes," she said quietly, "then neither can you." She'd already destroyed half my supply. The remaining vials were lined up on the counter next to the disposal, their clear contents representing the difference between life and death for someone with type 1 diabetes. Without insulin, my blood sugar would begin rising within hours. Without treatment, I'd be in diabetic ketoacidosis by evening, unconscious by midnight, and dead within days. It was Thanksgiving weekend. The pharmacy wouldn't reopen until Monday. Our parents were at early morning Black Friday sales, unreachable by phone in crowded stores. The nearest hospital was 2 hours away, and Jade stood between me and any means of getting help. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her finger hovering over the disposal switch. "You're going to tell Mom and Dad that you coached me through faking diabetes because you wanted someone to share the attention. You'll admit that you helped me research symptoms, taught me how to fake episodes, encouraged me to join support groups and waste medical resources. You'll take responsibility for everything I did." My blood sugar was already beginning to climb. I could feel the early warning signs: increased thirst, the need to urinate, a subtle nausea that would soon become violent vomiting. The clock was ticking, and she knew it. Chapter 9. "The countdown chews quickly," Jade said, tilting one vial toward the drain. "Your blood sugar's already climbing. How high can it go before your organs start shutting down? 500, 600? I remember that time when you were little, you were so sick you couldn't even stand up." She was right to reference that memory. I'd been hospitalized with blood sugar over 650 milligrams DL, barely conscious and on the verge of coma. The experience had been terrifying for the whole family, but apparently Jade had filed it away as useful information for future manipulation. I tried to think rationally despite the growing panic. The landline was in the living room, but Jade was blocking the kitchen doorway. My cell phone was charging upstairs, but she'd follow me if I tried to reach it. Even if I could call for help, an ambulance would take at least 30 minutes to arrive, and she could destroy everything before they got here. "I can see you calculating," Jade observed. "There's no way out of this. Just tell them what I want you to say, and I'll give you back your insulin. Simple trade, your life for your reputation." She dropped one vial into the disposal and flipped the switch. The grinding sound of destroyed medication made me physically ill. Thousands of dollars of life-saving medicine disappeared in seconds while Jade watched my face, studying my reaction to the sound of my own death being prepared. "That's one down," she said cheerfully. "You've got maybe 4 hours now instead of 6. Want to try again?" My hands were starting to shake. Not from hypoglycemia this time, but from the adrenaline of facing mortal danger combined with the early stages of hyperglycemia. The metallic taste was beginning in my mouth, a sign that ketones were starting to form as my body began the process of starvation in the midst of plenty. "You know what the funny part is?" Jade continued conversationally. "I actually learned so much about diabetes from watching you all these years. I know exactly what's happening in your body right now. Your cells are starving because they can't access the glucose in your blood without insulin. Your liver is dumping more sugar, trying to provide energy, but it's just making everything worse." She was right, and her clinical knowledge made the situation more terrifying. This wasn't an act of passion or temporary anger. It was a calculated attempt at murder, planned and executed by someone who understood exactly what she was doing and what the consequences would be. "In about an hour, you'll start vomiting," she continued. "Then comes the confusion, the weakness. Your breathing will get rapid and shallow as your body tries to compensate for the acid building up in your blood. I've seen you in DKA before, remember? When I threw away your insulin before that camping trip? You nearly died then, but Mom and Dad saved you. This time, I'm the only one who can save you. Chapter 10. The negotiation. The room felt too warm as my body temperature began to rise with my blood sugar. My skin was taking on that characteristic flush of severe hyperglycemia, dry and hot to the touch. I needed water desperately, but Jade controlled access to the sink, and leaving to get a drink would mean abandoning the remaining insulin to her mercy. What happens when I'm unconscious on this floor? I managed to ask. When they find me in a coma, you think they'll believe I coached you after you've literally murdered me? You're being dramatic, Jade replied. You won't die. You'll just get sick enough that when I find you and save you with this insulin, you'll be grateful enough to say whatever I want. I'll be the hero who found her poor diabetic sister in crisis and saved the day. Finally, I'll be the one taking care of you instead of the other way around. Her plan was more sophisticated than simple revenge. She intended to let me reach the edge of death, then rescue me at the last moment, positioning herself as my savior while I was too grateful and disoriented to contradict whatever story she wanted to tell. It was a level of psychological manipulation that went far beyond sibling rivalry into the realm of genuine psychopathy. My vision was starting to blur slightly, not enough to be immediately dangerous, but enough to confirm that my blood sugar was climbing past 350 mgl. The fruity smell of ketones was becoming noticeable on my breath, a sign that my body was beginning to break down fat for energy, producing acidic compounds that would eventually poison my blood. You want some water? Jade asked mockingly. Your mouth must be so dry by now. That's what, 400? How high does your meter even read before it just says hi? She was taunting me with knowledge gained from years of observation, details about my condition that she was now using as weapons. Every symptom I'd ever experienced, every fear I'd shared, every vulnerability I'd revealed, all of it was now ammunition in her psychological warfare. The doorbell rang, making us both freeze. Through the kitchen window, I could see a delivery truck. The driver stood at our front door with a package, ringing again when no one answered immediately. Jade's eyes went wide with panic. She hadn't planned for interruptions. Stay here, she hissed, quickly pocketing several insulin vials and leaving the rest lined up by the disposal. Don't move, don't make a sound. If you try anything, I'll destroy everything the moment I get back. She composed herself and walked to the front door, her voice artificially cheerful as she thanked the delivery driver for working on the holiday weekend. I heard their muffled conversation, her practiced performance of normalcy while holding my life hostage just rooms away. The interaction gave me precious seconds to think, but my options remained limited. I was growing weaker as my blood sugar climbed, and the cognitive effects were beginning to cloud my judgment. Simple decision-making was becoming more difficult as my brain was starved of usable glucose, despite the dangerous excess circulating in my bloodstream. Chapter 11. Witnesses. Jade returned from the front door more agitated than before. The interruption had shown her how precarious her plan was. Anyone could arrive unexpectedly. Our parents might return early. Neighbors might notice something wrong. She needed to finish this quickly, but she also needed me coherent enough to deliver the confession she demanded. We need to speed this up, she said, picking up another vial. I want to hear you practice the story. Every detail has to be perfect. How you supposedly taught me to fake symptoms, how we planned everything together, how you helped me research diabetes to make my performance convincing. My tongue was sticking to the roof of my mouth from dehydration. Speaking was becoming difficult, and forming coherent thoughts required increasing effort. The room seemed to tilt slightly when I tried to focus on her face. I was entering the dangerous phase of diabetic ketoacidosis where brain function begins to deteriorate. I can't, I started to say, but Jade cut me off. Wrong answer, she said, dropping another vial into the disposal. The grinding sound echoed through the kitchen, another few days of life destroyed in seconds. That's 2 down. You've got maybe 2 hours left before you start losing consciousness. Want to try again? The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. We both looked toward the front door, but this time the visitor wasn't leaving. Mrs. Buford's voice called through the door, asking if everything was okay. She'd seen the delivery truck leave and noticed our parents' car was gone, worried about us being alone during the holiday weekend. Jade's face went pale. Mrs. Buford was the kind of neighbor who baked cookies for sick people and checked on everyone in the neighborhood. She knew about my diabetes and would be concerned if she sensed something was wrong. More importantly, she had a spare key that our parents had given her for emergencies. Just a minute, Mrs. Buford, Jade called out, her voice shaking slightly. We're fine. Just sleeping in from the holiday. But Mrs. Buford wasn't convinced. She mentioned through the door that she'd brought leftover pie from Thanksgiving dinner and wanted to make sure we were both okay. Her tone carried the suspicion of someone who'd raised children and grandchildren, who could detect when something wasn't right. I tried to call out, but only managed a weak moan. Jade clamped her hand over my mouth, her palms sweaty with panic. Mrs. Buford knocked harder, her voice more insistent. She announced that she was getting worried and might need to call our parents. That threat galvanized Jade. She couldn't have Mrs. Buford calling our parents and alerting them to come home early. She smoothed her hair and walked to the door, cracking it open just enough to show her face. "Hi, Mrs. Buford. Really, we're fine. My sister's just feeling a little sick. Something she ate yesterday, I think. She's resting in bed." But Mrs. Buford had known me since I was 5 years old. She asked to see me specifically, mentioning that she knew about my diabetes and always worried when she didn't see me outside like usual. Her concern was genuine and persistent. Jade made excuses, but Mrs. Buford's tone grew more suspicious with each evasion. The conversation stretched on, and I could hear the doubt cray.